What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back in the video. I'd say a slightly better week for the waiver wire than we've been getting, I'd say like the last month. But realistically, there's still very little to go over. We do have some solid streaming options at quarterback, at defense. We've got some new names at running back and tight end. But as of right now, there's still no one I'd be worth spending a number one claim on. The first player we'll go over is the closest I think could be worth it for some people, but I still think at the end of the day, no one worth number one claim. So start with running back, where the player I'm alluding to is Audric Estime. As many of you know, I was all in on Jacobs, Henry, and Saquon this season at running back. Ton of exposure to those three, but to many people's surprise, my second most drafted running back was actually Audric Estime. My model loved him throughout the offseason. It's pretty clear that Sean Payton did as well. So I just thought, Sean Payton historically, there's a lot of running back production fantasy to his running backs. If this kid was going to be going in the 18th round of drafts, why not take him super late? If he ends up being the number one, we could have a lot of upside. The issue so far with Estime has been, number one, he starts the season, first game, looks decent, gets injured immediately, so he has time to come back from that. The ground game in general has been far less productive for Denver than we initially expected. And then also these fumbling issues. So he's had troubles holding on to the football. Coaches, I don't really care. I mean, I care a little bit how good you are. Like if you are Saquon Barkley and you fumble the ball, you're probably getting right back into the game. But for most running backs that are not Saquon Barkley or not Derrick Henry, you start fumbling the ball, you are going to ride the bench. It doesn't matter if you're a little bit better than the other running backs. You have to hang on to the football. But when healthy, Estime has been pretty good. And when he's been playing, when he's been getting opportunity, he has been productive. This last week, they did have a bottom three matchup against the Chiefs. And it's not like his ending stat line was all that amazing, but he was the one to get the hot hand. The final split in touches was 14 touches for Estime, only 3 for Javonte Williams, 2 for Jaleel McLaughlin. That is a lot of people really excited rest of the season for Estime because, realistically, how often is it that a number one running back, someone apparently capable of 14 plus touches in a week, becomes available in virtually 100% of leagues? Because I would say the vast majority of leagues, no one is rostering Audric Estime. My caution here, though, is number one, he's one fumble away at any point of the season from just getting completely benched. So you have to know that even if, next week he goes out there, he has 14 more carries, 2 receptions, and you're like, you know what, I'm starting him the following week. We kind of have to just know one fumble, and they will go to the running back. So that adds a lot of risk to him each week. Then this week, of course, they went with him, but who's to say it's not Javonte Williams next week? Who's to say it's not Jaleel McLaughlin the week after that? Like, if they're going to go with the hot hand, it is possible that Estime is not the hot hand moving forward. And then also no role in the receiving game. We knew that coming out of college. He just wasn't someone we were expecting to be used heavily in the receiving game. Still only has 1 target, 0 receptions on the season. So should he be rostered in over 80% of leagues after waivers clear this week? Yes, absolutely. A team's number one running back, or even a running back with the potential, because we don't know going to next week, the potential to be a team's number one should not be on free agency. But in terms of spending a number one claim, I'm not sure I would do that because I don't see any sort of real ceiling. Like going into the year, I thought there was a much higher ceiling than there is. I still think he can be productive to end the year, but we just had Jaleel and Javonte Williams combine for 5 touches. And again, it was in a brutal matchup, a bottom 3 matchup running back. So let's see moving forward if they get into better matchups, if he can be productive. And it makes sense he's getting these touches because those two have not been good this season. But even in a game where those two combined for 5 touches, he's still, he scored like 5 fantasy points. He didn't actually do all that much. So I'm rooting for him rest of the season. I would very much like him to go off rest of the season. I don't think I'd spend a number one claim, but it's completely up to you, right? It's your team. If you especially need running back, you're like, Nick, I have so many injuries at running back, I cannot get any production. He at least has a chance to do so. Sure, use number one claim, your team, do what you want with it. Okay, that was probably a lot for one player, but realistically, that's the player this week. Like Audric Estime is the player that everyone's going to have to look at this week and be like, do I want to go after him? That's kind of my overall take there. For a ton of the other players we go over, we've been over them. And so you've had this decision before. You kind of understand what the decision is for your team with a lot of these players. I'm actually not going to go over any more running backs because I made a new page on my website. It is completely free for anyone to see. It's called like Top Running Back Handcuffs. And basically every Monday after I make this video, I'm going to go through and just update that as a tiered list of all the running back handcuffs. So I just go through and say, okay, if these players are on free agency, or let's just pretend they're all on free agency, how would I order them in order of like my preference for my team, knowing full well that like a tier 3 running back next week could still be number 1 claim if there's an injury. So we have to understand that we can't predict injuries. There's a lot of backup running backs. A lot of them do have upside, and pretty much all of them need an injury to be productive. So we don't know who's going to get hurt, but we still have an ordering to kind of who we would want amongst them because of their ceiling if they end up as a starter. So that list, that tiered list, is going to go over that with some thoughts on each of the players. So again, completely from my website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. I would just reference that if you're doing any sort of like waiver move for a handcuff. At wide receiver, I only really have 4 names that are kind of newer this week, but 2 of them honestly have been over recently, been over a lot this season. First 2, Quentin Johnson and Audric Pearsall. I don't think either one of these 2 has like a wide receiver 2 in fantasy ceiling rest of season, at least in terms of like say like a 12-team league. Both are players that have upside, and especially in the coming weeks. You know, we've got 4 teams on bye this week. We've got 6 teams on bye next week. So you're going to have a lot of people that you're usually relying on not playing, and some good teams are on bye this week and next week as well. So I think those are 2 that like you could definitely mix and match into the flex spot, into the second flex spot, into like maybe it is wide receiver 2 if you've got a lot of wide receivers on bye. Quentin has been playing a lot better this season. His metrics were terrible as a rookie, like completely horrible. He was in like the first percentile in like route success rate. Like he was awful, playing way better, not amazing. And he's gotten a lot of production from blown coverages, which is a stat I've seen float around a lot. One thing I want to note on that, if you see that float around, is that is sort of his game. Like in one aspect, it's like, yes, he's gotten lucky. Like absolutely Quentin Johnson has gotten lucky with some big plays on blown coverages. But he runs those deeper routes. And so those are the routes that are going to benefit more from blown coverage. If you're running a bunch of underneath routes, there's really no possible way for you to benefit from a blown coverage because you're running 2 yards downfield. Even if the coverage is blown, there are people later downfield that will get to you. But if you blow a coverage 40 yards downfield, it's a 40-plus yard touchdown, right? So he's just naturally going to benefit more. There's that saying that it's like, in order to get extremely lucky, you have to put yourself in position to do so. You can look at the amount of yards and touchdowns that Quentin Johnson has gained from blown coverages and say that it's unsustainable. But you also need to realize that most wide receivers aren't even putting themselves in position to get that lucky. So the simple fact that he is running this many deep routes, that he does have elite red zone usage, that he's now on a pass heavy team, or a team that is now pass heavy, hasn't changed teams, but the Chargers are more pass heavy now than they were before. He's got an elite quarterback. It just means that he's going to get more lucky than a lot of other players. So again, I think he should be rostered everywhere. And again, a flex spot is a good spot to use in the next couple of weeks. And then Pearsall, you all know he was my most rostered player in literally best ball, redraft, dynasty. Like he's the player I own the most of in all formats. I thought he had the best chance to be this year's Puka, just in terms of like a wide receiver that was drafted in the later rounds of fantasy that ends up at some point being a wide receiver 1. I don't think it's going to happen to any wide receiver, any rookie wide receiver that like was actually drafted late in fantasy. Of course, you could argue like Marvin Harrison Jr., you could argue like Neighbors, but they were not drafted in the later rounds of fantasy. But yeah, I think he still has that ceiling. I still stand behind the fact that I would want Juwan Jennings over him right now. I really like Pearsall as a player. I still think he's so young in his career, right? He's had 3 games. The last 2 games, he's actually been pretty good in fantasy. So he's another player that I think you can kind of slide into the flex spot right now. Understand that, you know, San Fran has a ton of really good players. And so naturally anyone could have a dud in any game. But again, Quentin Johnson, Audric Pearsall, good flex plays moving forward and should be rostered in basically every league. Behind those 2, the 2 newer names this week are Mike Williams and Marquez Valdes-Scantling. I'll come right out and say, like, I had to talk about MVS, obviously, because he's coming off a monster game. I couldn't see myself actually rostering MVS. I know he had a really, really strong game, and you could be like, oh, is he going to be, their new like Rashid Shaheed, right? An explosive offense. He's their deep threat. I mean, maybe. What are the odds we're actually relying on MVS down the line? Like in the next couple of weeks, you better have a lot of injuries, a lot of teams on bye, especially when Cedric Wilson comes back, for you to actually be starting MVS in the flex spot and be like, I feel good about this. He could easily have 0 receptions next week. So I don't think I'd go after him. But if you really wanted to spend like 1% of your fab, if you wanted to add him and not claim him in those types of leagues, like, sure, you've got someone on your bench that got hurt this week and you don't want anymore. Sure, but please do not rely on MVS. He's not going to do that every week. Mike Williams, I could actually see playing him at some point. This last week, he didn't play much because he just joined the team, right? He wasn't in, or he doesn't really know the playbook. He wasn't going to use many packages. But next couple of weeks, maybe like starting week 13 or so, could he approach a full snap share? And we know that Russell Wilson is perfectly willing to throw that jump ball. So this is a really good offensive fit for Mike Williams, and maybe he's someone who could be used in the flex spot once we get to fantasy playoffs. Pittsburgh faces the Eagles, the Ravens, and the Chiefs in the fantasy playoffs. So all 3 of those are games that we know that Pittsburgh is probably not going to get up by 3 scores and run the ball. They're probably going to be competitive in all 3 games. And we know that especially for Kansas City and Baltimore, those are 2 really, really good run defenses that force teams to throw the ball at elevated rates. So really good matchups potentially for Williams. And I think for all these guys, like I do still prefer Quentin and Pearsall, but Williams probably has that most potential to like turn into someone who you're throwing to the flex spot in the fantasy playoffs and actually has like a really good game, because those are really good matchups, especially the semifinals against the Ravens. That's a good matchup. There's a world where we like rank Mike Williams as a very viable, a strong start in that week. At tight end, we actually have 3 okay options. No clear tight end ones. That time has passed. Like, there's really just not going to be another like Cade Otton, David Njoku. Like when these guys were showing up on free agency early in the season, none of those are going to show up anymore. But for spot starts, honestly, Dawson Knox, this is one of the better spot starts we'll possibly have for tight end all season. We don't know yet the status of Dalton Kincaid. He left the game with a knee injury this week. If he's forced to miss any time, we know that Knox is going to play virtually every passing down snap. He's going to have a very large role in the red zone. So he'd be a good play at home against Kansas City. Kansas City also funnels a lot of production to tight ends. So if you have Kincaid who got hurt, if you have Trey McBride is on bye, Cade Otton is on bye. So any of those 3, which will actually encompass like a lot of you, honestly, Dawson Knox is probably who I'd go after this week. Besides him, you could go after Taysom Hill. He's been getting like 4 to 5 carries, a couple of targets every week. Week 9, he had more production than week 10, but he's always a threat to score a touchdown. The touchdowns, of course, are going to be random. He's not going to score a touchdown every week. And just with how banged up this offense is, they're going to get him 5 to 6 touches every week. Is he going to score every week? No. But any tight end getting 5 to 6 touches, the floor can push up to 10 touches. That's more than you can say about a lot of tight ends. It does stink that like a lot of those touches come on the ground. And so if you play in a full PPR league, not really as good of an option. I would probably want to go after Dawson Knox if you play in full PPR especially, but an option still, because he can still, rack up a few receptions, score a touchdown, and he's still be fine. And then the final one I would look at is Will Dissly. We were mentioning him before in a lot of weeks as a streaming option when Hurst was out. Hayden Hurst is back. I thought that when Hurst returns, Dissly would see a much more reduced role than he did. His playing time went down for sure, but he still earned 6 targets. He dropped a 19-yard touchdown, catches that. He has 6 or 49 and a score. So it's not like he had an amazing day. I think, it was 5 for 30. That's only 8 full PPR points. But again, he was more involved in the offense than I thought he would be. Whole second half of that game, they were winning. They didn't need to throw it. Like if they run into some games where they have to throw the ball, like he's not a great play, and he's not a very high ceiling play. But again, if you need someone in a 12-team league, you've got Kincaid, McBride, Otton. That's a huge percentage of people in leagues have those guys that they're starting. He's not a bad start against the Bengals this week. For quarterback streaming, you have 4 options. Russell Wilson versus the Ravens, Justin Herbert versus the Bengals, Matthew Stafford at the Patriots, and then Jameis Winston at the Saints. We will see exactly what my week 11 projections say. A lot of times I would prefer to just wait for those to come out on Tuesday afternoon, look at those, see who the highest ranked quarterback is, and kind of go from there. That's really how I'd more approach it, because I just want to have the projections, obviously, on Monday morning. But if I had to guess, that's the order I'd put them at. Again, Wilson, Herbert, Stafford, and Winston. I think that's like your kind of your best streaming options this week. Baltimore is just the perfect matchup for quarterbacks. You can't run on them. Their pass defense is a joke, and then their offense is so good that you're going to have to keep pace. You're going to have to remain aggressive. It's just like that's why they've given up, the league lead in passing yards per game by a mile. Is just you have to throw against them, and they're a bad pass defense. So Russell Wilson is going to have a really strong projection this week. Herbert, we've talked about him in so many videos recently, is being like they are throwing the ball a lot more than the public thinks. And when you're facing the Bengals, right, you're going to have to stay aggressive. So it's a great spot for Herbert as well. Stafford plays tonight. So this is one, especially we're going to talk about the Rams defense streaming option as well. With any Rams player, see what happens tonight, see how they kind of look. That's going to kind of influence our take moving forward. But assuming that Kupp and Puka can stay healthy tonight, good spot against the Patriots. I know Caleb did nothing last week, but the Bears offense is just completely lost right now. The Rams are going to look better than the Bears did this last week. So Stafford, again, assuming his two wide receivers stay healthy, he'll be a good option against New England. And then Jameis, check the weather though. I don't know the weather yet. It's at New England. New England sometimes this time of year can be kind of gross. Just check the weather there. But then Winston coming off bye. Gets a solid matchup at the Saints. It's in a dome. He has over 40, I think it's 41 and 46 pass attempts in the last two starts. His only two starts of the season. He's going to throw the ball 40 plus times in a dome against a pretty poor defense. Like, he's got a pretty sweet ceiling this weekend. And then finally, defense streaming options. I actually see 5 options. Whenever you have that, what I do with defense is basically say, okay, here are 4 defenses I feel pretty solid about. If no one defense is separating by a ton, just put like 2, 3, 4% of your fab, whatever it is. You can kind of extend fab more now. So we're into week 11 right now. If you like a player and you've got like 80% of your fab still left, like don't put 2%. Like just up your fab now, right? If you've been hanging on to it, there's no reason to end the season with 70% of your fab still left. So up your fab if you haven't been doing so yet. But basically just put kind of an even percent on all of them. You'll end up with one of them. But Packers at the Bears, I think we go in order of what I think is going to be best to worst. But again, I will have rankings, of course, on the website. But Packers at the Bears. The Packers, of course, have a much better defense in New England. And I mean, New England looked like an elite defense against the Bears. We know New England is not elite defense. The Bears offense, again, completely lost. They really need to change up who's calling plays over there. You've got the Lions versus the Jaguars. Mac Jones, I would say, is better than a lot of backups in the NFL, but there's a reason. He's a backup quarterback. He's obviously not that good. He'll be forced to drop back a ton against the Lions. That is a recipe for disaster. Final top tier defense, I would say, is the Texans at the Cowboys. I don't know yet what quarterback is going to start for Dallas. You kind of hope if you stream a defense that it is Trey Lance, but whether it's Cooper Rush or Trey Lance, the Texans are going to be a really good play. I mean, Dallas has looked lost with Dak. You go to these backup quarterbacks that are not very good, they're not going to look good moving forward. And then we have 2, I would say, tier 2 defenses in my eyes. You got the Rams at the Patriots. Again, comes down to how they look tonight. If they get absolutely ripped apart by Miami, I'm going to feel a little bit less confidence in them. But of course, Miami's better than New England, right? And as long as the Rams defense looks okay tonight, obviously the Patriots don't have a scary defense on a scary team to go against. Their offensive line is much worse than it looked. Again, the Bears have just not been good recently, but especially if the Rams can pull ahead, because the Patriots can surprise teams if they get a lead and they can lean on the ground game, play safe on offense. But if the Rams got ahead next week and you force the Patriots to drop back a lot, to be more aggressive, that's where the offensive line can fall apart. That's where they can fall apart just like in general, having to throw to scrub wide receivers. That's where you can have these elevated sack spots, elevated turnover spots against New England. But if you let them play from ahead, they're obviously not put in position to be aggressive, which lowers the chance for turnovers, lowers the chance for defensive touchdowns, for sacks, all that sort of thing. So Rams going to be a better spot than the Bears were. And then finally, Browns at the Saints. I don't really know how the Saints beat the Falcons this week, but you have to think that just given all these injuries on offense, and with the Browns also be given, more time to prepare coming off their bye, it's a good spot for the Browns defense. They're averaging 4 sacks per game over the last 3 games. And I feel like if you kind of look up at points against, production against the Browns, it's a little bit unfair. Last 5 opponents the Browns have faced: Commanders, Eagles, Bengals, Ravens, and Chargers. I mean, you can dream up a worse 5-week schedule, but you can't dream up much of a worse 5-week schedule. So I think their defense is better than they've been showing on paper, than the metrics indicate. So going up against a Saints offense that, again, has probably overperformed this last week, just given what they have, you got to think, if your top wide receiver is Marquez Valdes-Scantling, if you have absolutely no depth behind Kamara, if things turn bad, they can turn really bad for the Saints. So again, I think the Browns will be good. But yeah, there's 5 options. There's actually a lot of options for streaming defense this week. So good luck to everyone in their matchups tonight. I need at least 16 half PPR points from Achane and Cup combined for a much needed win this week. So I'm sure both those two will do terrible, but please root for those two for my win. That'll do it for this one though. Please subscribe if you're new to the channel. It really helps me out. And I'll catch you all on the Wednesday trade video.